Hello, interweb! It is I, Mr. Hosking, here with another fun-filled video finishing up Imperialism. I thought this time we would try some intro music, so we'll see how this works. We'll see. I mean, we're trying stuff new every time, right? So we'll try it out. Here we go. I'm not even going to be on screen. I mean, we try new stuff all the time, right? Today we're going to finish up imperialism. The first place we're looking at is where Europe is imperializing around the world. We'll start with Africa. It's the first place they imperialize, and it is almost completely imperialized. So in 1880s, Europe only controlled about 10% of Africa. 34 years later, they control all of Africa except for Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia, this gray spot over here, is created by the United States for freed slaves to return to Africa if they want. And this part over here is Ethiopia. And that they had a strong king who had a relationship with Europeans, and so he was able to hold out from being controlled by Europe. The Conference of Berlin from 1884 to 1885 is a meeting of all of the European nations. It's held by Otto von Bismarck, a German, and their goal is to establish rules for the conquest of Africa. It's a way to fairly conquer Africa without fighting between the Europeans. This is completely ignoring the fact that there are Africans in Africa. This is completely ignoring the fact that there are culture groups that are there. And they're just basically like, well, Germany, what part of Africa would you like? As if they were dividing a pie. They just kind of cut and paste and take all different parts of Africa and they divide all of Africa amongst the European nations. This keeps conflict from happening between the European countries, not between Europe and Africa. One positive for Africa is that they do agree to stop slavery and slave trade leaving Africa, although they will treat the Africans, like slaves. In Africa, they're no longer being traded outside of Africa. If we were looking at a color map, we would be able to see that Germany takes control of Cameroon, Togo, Southwest Africa, and East Africa. France takes control of Tunisia, Algeria, French, West Africa, oh my bad, and Italy takes control of Libya, and then Britain, perhaps most enlightened of the imperialist powers, though they're still pretty oppressive of their people. They take control of Egypt. They push southward into Sudan. And one example of the advantages that the Europeans have over the Africans is their technology. And in the Battle of Omdurman, the much smaller British army is able to kill 11,000 Sudanese tribesmen while only 28 Britons died. It shows a huge discrepancy if you think about fighting with the Maxim gun or machine guns against people with spears and shields. The machine gun's going to win. You're not going to show up to a gunfight with a wadded up paper ball. You're not going to win. So I'm going to just go backwards here to this colored map. We see the dark blue being France is up in here, and down in Madagascar, you know where that is with all those cute penguins. The pink is Great Britain, and you can notice that most of Africa is divided up between Great Britain and France. Portugal does control a couple of small spots. Germany controls some spots throughout Africa. Spain has little control on the coast, the north coast, and right close to where Spain actually is. Italy, directly south of Italy, they control, as well as the coast over here. And then the two independent countries, Liberia and Ethiopia. So South Africa and the Boer War. It's not Boer like Mr. Hosking is boring you. It's Boer, B-O-E-R. They are Dutch people living in South Africa. They're actually peaceful settlers and farmers that took over areas down there just north of South Africa. From 1899 to 1902, Cecil Rhodes became the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and they have this idea of controlling all of the land from South Africa all the way up to Egypt. So having from Cape to Cairo, completely controlled by Britain. And they felt that Britain should dominate the continent. Diamonds and gold were discovered in the Transvaal, and Rhodes wanted to control Britain's control of that area. But Dutch settlers, the Boers, lived in that area, so they were fighting against the British, and they were having a lot of trouble defeating the Boers. The British could not beat the Boers easily. Another problem is that the Germans start to support the Boers to try and keep the British from winning. But eventually, the massive British force defeats the Boers, and in 1910, all of those different free colonies combined together to create South Africa. India, the jewel of the British Empire. The British East India Company took its last native state in India by 1848. Robert Clive captures military posts in Madras, and England ousted France from India, and Britain will control all of India by 1857. The Sepoy Mutiny happens from 1857 to 1858. Again, another showing of the European countries not really caring about the cultures of the people living in these different places where they're taking over. The Sepoys are Hindu and Muslim. They feel that cows are sacred. The British were protecting their bullets in cow fat and sending them to their soldiers that are Hindu and Muslim. And the Hindu and Muslims were expected to rip the cow fat open with their teeth, take the bullet out, and put it into the gun to shoot it. This is against their religion. They are not allowed to put cow fat in their mouth. So they revolt against England because they're forced to do this. After 1858, India, is ruled by British Parliament in London and administered by a tiny all-white civil service in India. Even up to today, all governmental business that's done in India is in English, in the English language, because of the culture kind of removal of power by the British and replaced by Britain. They reform India. They modernize secondary education. They have economic reforms. They irrigate. They put railroads all over the country. They start planting tea and jute. They create one unified and powerful state. All of these may be being positive, but it's the destruction of the Indian culture that's there, and it's replaced with all of these things that are very British. The British Empire, by 1900, Britain controls 20% of the world's territory. That includes Australia, Canada, India, all of that Transvaal area in Africa. And it's called the empire upon which the sun never sets. As the sun goes across the skyline, it always hits on part of the British Empire. You can see they control parts of the world all over. So you could say it's possible to travel around the world by railroad and sea, moving only through British territories, right? You could probably take a little boat and then go across Australia, and then travel by boat, and then take a railroad, and then travel by boat, and then take a railroad, and then travel by boat back to where you were. Like that's what they're kind of saying. Asia. In France, Jules Ferry wants to control Indochina. They do have a lot of oil there. They do have a lot of rubber, those things being very important. Very important natural resources. We see Britain controls Burma, the Malay Peninsula, and North Borneo. We see Germany controls a bunch of the small Pacific islands. Russia controls Persia, or what we would call today Iran, and they also control the outlying provinces of China. And then in 1898, America fights a war with Spain. The United States defeats Spain, and they take control of the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and on the other coast in the Atlantic, Cuba. Responses to Western imperialism in Asia. India is the jewel of the British Empire. They protect it no matter what. And the Mughal Empire, the Muslims in India subcontinent, falls apart and is destroyed. For China and Japan, China is carved into several different spheres of influence in the late 19th century. The Sino-Japanese War reveals China's helplessness. Japan is able to defeat the Chinese in a war which starts a rush for foreign concessions. The foreign countries that are having these spheres of influence are asking for more and more from the Chinese people. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan each come to control a piece of Eastern Russia, or Eastern China, excuse me. And in 1899, the United States sponsors the open door policy. Basically, the United States is trying to be a big old Badinsky saying, hey, we should be able to get into China too, not just you guys who were here first. So they want to open commerce to imperial latecomers, so that the Europeans to allow free trade within China while respecting its territorial integrity. This is not popular and won't come to fruition until the Boxer Rebellion. Japan, on the other hand, they win the Sino-Japanese War, so they're able to kind of look like a powerful country. So they begin to modernize fast. They talk to German generals and German weapon producers, and they buy enormous amounts of weapons. They have generals come in to train their army, and Japan modernizes very, very quickly. The Meiji Restoration starts in 1867. It results in a series of reforms where Japan will be able to start competing with Western nations, eventually culminating in the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan is able to defeat Russia, which is considered to be like impossible for one of these foreign countries. Again, we're talking about this racist ideology by the Europeans thinking that they're better than everybody else. So now they have this foreigners, these non-Europeans, these Asians defeat a European country, and they think that's impossible. So it kind of starts a movement away from that idea. What are some of the outcomes of imperialism? Mostly negative outcomes. Let's be honest. Much of the land was taken over by other countries. So a lot of countries are taken over by Europe. They don't care about the people that live there, so we see a lot of countries are splitting up ethnic groups into separate countries. They combine enemy ethnic groups into the same country. If you've ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda or know about the Rwandan genocide, this is because the country of Rwanda was created by Great Britain without caring who lives in the country. And the Hutus and the Tutsis are two tribes that are there, and they fight against each other because they hate each other. They historically hate each other. And the British arm one side, and that leads to a genocide. There's more powerful weapons introduced to existing warring factions. Like I just said, the Hutu and Tutsis were fighting against each other, but it was pretty fair when it was both sides having spears and shields. Well, now one side has machine guns and the other side has spears and shields, and it becomes very unfair, and we start to see genocides happening. The Europeans also introduced a bunch of foreign diseases, like we talk about the Aztec Empire being defeated by smallpox. These foreign diseases are now being introduced to Asia and Africa, and they don't have the immune systems to fight against them, and we see enormous amounts of deaths because of it. Social division, racial strife. The Europeans are considered a higher class of people in all of the areas that they take over, so that starts bad feelings between races. Countries are left underdeveloped, although they will develop countries for like trade with Europe. The crops that they usually they usually grow in these colonies are cash crops, things like tea, things like tobacco, things like cotton, things that can't sustain a population. So once imperialism ends, these countries are completely reliant on trade to have food to survive, because their farms aren't equipped to make food anymore. We also see the destruction of traditional culture and that being replaced by European culture. Around the world, we're going to see Europeanism, like European culture spreads all over. That's why English is kind of the language of trade across the world. It's the destruction of the traditional cultures that were living there. Finally, it led to a power vacuum. A lot of African countries that are controlled by imperialist nations, when those imperialists leave, it leaves a power vacuum, and really evil, bad people take charge. And that's why we have problems like we do today in countries like Somalia, or in the Sudan, or in Rwanda again, or in Nigeria, where there are all sorts of bad leaders kind of treating the people poorly. Development of infrastructure is a positive. We'll see hospitals built. We'll see roads built. We'll see electric lines put up. We'll see railroads built. These things are really important for countries to have, and it's paid for by the British, although they're exploiting those countries so much, it's kind of a wash. But those infrastructures are being built. I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to very quickly go through these other positives. Advances in agriculture. We'll see agricultural output goes up because of modern advances in Europe. Moderation in wars during imperial times. The European nations are going to stop the tribes from fighting each other. And finally, the introduction of modern medicine. European medicine will be introduced to Africa. This has been a lesson by Mr. Hosking on imperialism. See you later, cyberspace.